So hello, welcome everyone today to our third coffee talk of the week. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Annemieke Smit and I have been contracted by Alberta Milk to conduct some of their research and extension activities. And I'm also a postdoc at the University of Calgary, which some of you may know me from as well. Jody will shortly paste a few Zoom use and housekeeping comments in the chat. And we did have the past two coffee talks we had two speakers, and today we have one speaker. So Nina from Keyserlingk will talk about calf housing for about 20 minutes, not much longer. So we would have at least 40 minutes for Q&A and conversation and discussion. Yeah, and with that, Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Annemieke. Okay, let me just share my screen here if I can get this sorted out. Do you see the presenter view?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. So first of all, again, thank you to Jody and Annemieke for asking me to do this today. I've called this talk Striving for High Standards of Calf Health and Welfare, an ideal strategy for both the calf and the farmer. And I'm just gonna go through a few things. Hold on a second, yeah. So first of all, before I go any further, I wanted to thank Alberta Milk. Many of you have heard my colleague Dan and I speak in the past, but Alberta Milk has been a longtime supporter of the animal welfare program, and we are now in years 20 to 25 of the industrial research chair in dairy cattle welfare. And so I just want to really, from both of us, thank you for your support. Without the support of the farmers in Alberta, British Columbia, now we also have Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the Dairy Farmers of Canada, and along with others, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. So today I want to talk about, I'm going to thread this a little bit with the draft code. Hopefully most of you have commented on it. I'm going to highlight some things that I think are just fantastic with the new code, and other things that I think we're heading in the right direction. But, I guess, as somebody who is working on the research side, of course, I would like to see things move a little bit faster, but I'm going to try and give you some reasons why, I really would love to see the dairy farmers be super proactive on some of these things. And I thought I would end with some of the things that are happening in terms of calf housing and calf care in other parts of the world as just examples of what could happen if industry doesn't move fast enough, I guess. So as many of you know, you guys, as dairy farmers, we started off feeding calves in a very different way than we feed calves today. We fed them 2 liters of milk in the morning, 2 liters of the milk in the evening. We spent time training them to drink from a bucket. And then lo and behold, what happened is those calves finished drinking the milk in about 45 seconds, and then they sucked on whatever else they could suck. And then, God forbid, if there was another calf in the pen, then they would suck on each other. And so we then adopted single housing as a way of mitigating cross sucking, and also to maintain, if we could better observe those calves, if it got sick, we could then deal with that calf, and then it wouldn't be touching another calf and transmitting of disease. So this is the code. I think it's, last time we talked about, the issue of feeding calves more milk. And I just took a screenshot. And the one thing I just wanted to highlight is the new requirements will be that neonatal calves must be offered a minimum total intake of 20%. So this is twice as much as we've done in the past. This was a recommended best practice in the first code, but it is now transitioned to as a requirement. And I just want to commend the dairy farmers on doing this. I know this has been a hard road, but we have so much evidence now that these calves are hungry if we don't feed them at least this. And as soon as we have hungry cows, we have a myriad of other problems like cross-sucking. There's also evidence that these calves that are fed low volumes of milk also have increased disease risks. And the cool thing is that the calves actually pay you back in the future. So there is growing evidence that these calves that are fed higher planes of nutrition during the milk feeding period will have increased milk production, especially in the first lactation. And there's a grow every few years, another study comes out. Don't forget, these are hard studies to do because you're actually following these calves for up to 3 years. But so this is absolutely fantastic. However, what is not a recommended practice, what is not a requirement, but a recommended practice is this issue of providing how we provide that milk. There is still, the way the new code is currently drafted, that it's still okay to do this via a bucket. It is recommended to use a teat, but it's not required. And I guess I caution you, those of you that are still bucket feeding, to postpone moving to teat feeding. And the reason for that is in the continuum. So we have the calf born, we feed higher volumes of milk, and we individually house. If we're trying to transition to social housing, which you as an industry have said that you want to do by 2033, without making teat feeding a requirement before that, when we hit January 1st, 2033, you're going to have producers learning how to teat feed and social housing at the same time. And to me, you tackle one problem at a time. So I would strongly encourage you to implement mandatory teat feeding or embrace that as soon as you can for those reasons. So effective January 1st, 2033 is currently in the code. As you can well imagine, there is a lot of questions from those outside of the industry, including processors and buyers, as to why the industry has decided to have an 11-year wait for this. I know it's challenging. I know it's difficult if you have never done this before, but to me, this is a risky area that you're waiting so long. And also, I've heard these conversations from others, like 2033, that actually means that we're going to have a new code in the middle. And, maybe then somebody will say, well, let's push it out even further. The other thing that is effective January 1st, 2029, calves must be tethered. Again, this comes back to, this is a 6-year wait. And I know that there's infrastructure changes that have to happen, but I also caution you in prolonging getting rid of tethering, because tethering is really restriction of movement. And we know that the consumer gets really wiggly if they see animals tied up. I was just in a talk yesterday in Wisconsin, and there's still a lot of tie stalls there. And there was a lot of stress because most of Europe is phasing out tie stalls. And the consumer, we've done this where we've looked at the public attitudes to tie stall tethering. And in the US, when we asked the public, they would actually vote to ban this if they were presented with a referendum on this. So just to talk about some of the benefits, and really, if you're not doing social housing yet, don't even consider going there until you're feeding your calves higher volumes of milk through a teat, because you want to make sure that they're not hungry. You want to minimize cross sucking and all of those other things. But some of the benefits of social housing, this was a study done by Andrea de Paula Vieira as part of her PhD. She looked at individual housing and pair housing. She paired as of 3 days of age, and then the pair was exactly the same as the individual. They were fed 8 liters of milk a day, 4 liters in the morning, 4 liters in the afternoon via a bucket. The pair was we just took out the middle divide. So everything, the space per calf was the same, all of that. She fed these calves, and then she started weaning them at day 48 of age. And she did a sort of a 4 or 5 day step down weaning procedure, kept them in their environments there. And this is where she just looks at weaning distress. And so this is calls, number per 2 hours, age in days. And what you can see, and she always weaned a single calf and a pair calf on the same day. So the single calves could see other calves, they just couldn't touch any other calves. So they could see calves across the alley. What you can see is the number of vocalizations was over twice as high on the single housed calves than it was in the pair house. And I often, my one-liner here is that if you're going to go through a stressful event, better to go through it with a friend than by yourself. We also saw higher intakes in terms of grain feeding in these calves that were pair housed. And I think what's happening there is social facilitation. One calf goes to start eating grain, and then the other one sees, oh, he's eating, I'm going to eat as well. So what she then did is she left the calves when they were fully weaned in those environments for an additional week, and then she moved them into a group housing pen. And in this case, she took the 3 calves in this pen already knew how to use the automatic grain feeder. And in their original housing, they were eating grain out of a bucket. So this was the first time that they were faced with an automatic grain feeder. So 3 calves knew how to use the bucket. The 3 calves knew how to use the automatic grain feeder, and she put in a pair and an individual. And then she looked at latency to their first meal. And what we see here is that the time to start feeding after regrouping or mixing is much, much faster in the pair house calves. They ate their first meal in 9 hours versus almost over 2 days before the individually housed calves. And this we argue, and we've done other work to show this, is we know from a handling perspective that the pair house calves are much calmer, much more likely to explore their environment, and much more likely to watch what the other calves are doing and mimic that. Whereas the individually housed calves are just freaked out, and they're just like yo-yos. We also know from other work that the pair house calves, or calves that are socially reared, have what we call increased cognitive flexibility. They find it, they can learn and relearn new things much, much easier. And I think this is something, as we move to more complex systems where there's a lot of learning involved, like AMS units, that these being socially reared from the get-go will likely be beneficial. We know that those calves that were individual, so they didn't eat for 2 days, and then they ate a ton, and then they dropped off, then they ate a ton and dropped off. And you can see that they have this really up and down in terms of intake. I would predict what's happening here is that when you didn't eat for 2 days, they ate so much grain that they probably were suffering from rumen acidosis. So the pH in the rumen fell. What does a ruminant do in order to get the pH to come back up again? It stops eating. And then it got hungry again, then they ate a ton again, and then they got a tummy ache again. The pair house calves never missed a beat. And this was reflected in the weight gain with this, what those of you that have ever seen intake patterns of feedlot cattle, this is on high grain diets. This is a classic weight gain. We call this yo-yoing. So they lost 2.5 kilos, they gained a kilo, they lost a kilo, they gained a kilo. And this is, I think, just reflective of them, having so much rumen upset with this slug feeding of grain. The pair house calves never missed a beat. So I really think this individual versus social housing is something that we've really got to move towards. One of the things that we were interested in is, I've shown you these studies where we force the calves individually, force the calves in pair. And Toma Eddy, who I know spoke to many of you yesterday, this is his the last study that he did with us before moving on to his postdoc in the US. But we're really interested in whether or not calves were socially motivated in very young ages. So he introduced these calves into this experimental paradigm at 5 days of age, and then he tested them until they were 3 weeks of age. And so each calf was put in the middle pen, and I'll show you another picture in a second. There's a plexiglass door here on a swing gate, and the calves could see the other calf. And in this case, every day on one or the other side, because he balanced for order, there would be another calf or empty space. And the calves could see the other calf, and then they actually self-taught themselves that if I guess by bumping them plexiglass, they could realize that they could push through the plexiglass. They could enter either side. And then what Toma did is every time they were successful, he would increase the weight in the bucket. So it got harder and harder to push that gate to the other calves. So here you can just see the photograph. So it was a see-through gate. And here what you see is that calves are highly motivated to access a social partner. So these are individual calves With the exception of B120, every other calf pushed way more weight to gain access to the side where the social partner was than it did for empty space. And so this is really strong evidence that having access to a social partner, even at very young ages, is important. So this is just Laura Whalen's study, just to show you. This was done on a commercial farm where a farmer was adopting pair housing, and this was just, putting gating around 2 existing hutches, to say that, this was basically a low-cost way of trying to get this done. I just want to end with 2 or 3 slides now on changes that are happening in Europe that will impact calf housing. Those of you that participated the other day, I talked about many countries in Europe now banning, either making it a regulation or the industry taking the initiative to ban the euthanizing of healthy newborn calves. So that's really changed the number of live calves on many of these farms. And Germany recently passed regulations last year, November of 21, but November of 20, they are now being enforced as of January 1st, 22, that calves, and it used to be 2 weeks that they were kept on the home farm, it is now illegal to transport these calves until they're 28 days of age. So this really has changed how farmers are having to manage their calves on their home farms, because they can no longer get rid of, before they're 4 weeks of age, these calves that will not become part of the milking herd. And what about social housing? Are farmer-run assurance programs enough to maintain public trust? And that's, I think, really the big question that the Canadian dairy industry has to ask itself. And I just want to give an example of the Red Tractor program in Europe, in the UK. This is very similar to ProAction and also the farm program in the US. This is a farmer assurance program. There is, I think, 10 or 11,000 dairy farms in the UK. I looked it up yesterday, and 98% of them are Red Tractor stamped. They are the minimum standards. They've stayed silent on social housing. And what we're seeing now, this is Marks and Spencer's, Tesco's, Morrison's, Waitrose, and Sainsbury's are retailers who are not, there's about 50% of the milk in the UK is fluid milk. 20% of that is controlled by these guys collectively. So each player is quite small, but they have implemented what we call process change in their buying scheme already. So even though Red Tractor stamped, these guys have said, look, if you're going to sell milk into my supply chain, you have to have social housing. And this is, we're asking for requirements higher than the Red Tractor. I get that in Canada we have pooled milk, and so this is not possible, for a retailer to come and say, look, I'm only going to buy milk from this farm. But this is just to give you an idea of what's happening. At the moment, the 2 biggest players in the UK are what they call more discount buyers, Arla and Müller. Arla, though, they control 25% of all dairy farms in the UK. They have already signed on to banning of surplus calf euthanasia in 21. And the thought is that it's only a matter of when, not if, they and others make the move to demanding all farmers within their supply chain socially house calves. So I guess I would encourage you, even if this does become the code, to really, as an industry, try to figure out how to help yourselves and your colleagues transition to social housing before you get to a point where you're forced to change overnight. You haven't implemented nipple feeding, because I think those things are going to be tough. Because the question is whether the voices along the supply chain will grow in number, questioning the 11-year wait to begin to transition, and will your social license to be farmed be questioned? On that note, we need to do everything we can to close the gap, because failure to do so increases your reputational risk. And on that note, thank you. I think I was sort of on time.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Lina. That was a very interesting talk, and I think also very timely regarding the revisions on the code of practice, and including the current and the future requirements. And I think you addressed some very important aspects to help the dairy farmers to be successful in social housing of their calves. And I also think you showed some really great benefits of this type of housing, especially what you mentioned about, well, they also do better as adult cows. So very interesting. And I think this would be a great moment for our facilitators to turn on their cameras. Miranda and Betty Jo. Miranda is a dairy producer in Alberta, and Betty Jo is a veterinarian in Alberta. And they will facilitate this part of the coffee talk, so the Q&A and the slash the conversation that will follow. And then I will join you again a little bit before the end of the webinar. So with that, Miranda, Betty Jo, the floor is yours.
I'll start with the first question. Thank you, Nina, for your presentation. The first question is from the chat. Has there been any research done on the increase in the probability of infectious disease when social housed, and if the positives of social housing outweigh the cost of increased disease, if there is increased disease?
So yes, a great question. And it is really, I mean, I think that's the big challenge. We know that we have traditionally had quite high morbidity rates in young calves. And I think Betty Jo, as a vet, has seen some of that with infectious diseases, respiratory challenges. So there has been work. It's tough work to do because, you've got to have lots and lots of calves. But some of the best studies have come out of Northern Europe, similar climates to what we have here. And there's been a number of studies that showed that individual versus small groups, so less than 8 calves, 8 or 10 calves maximum, we see no difference in disease. Where you run into problems are large groups. Large groups require absolutely everything to go right all the time. And if it doesn't, of course, disease can spread drastically. But don't forget, also a huge reason why we see, I think, less challenges with disease in these small groups compared to individual is because we're feeding much higher planes of nutrition. So if you have individual calves and they're super hungry, we also know that they've got to do a lot. They got to grow. They've got this colostrum, which gives them passive immunity. At about day 9, 10, they've got to transition to active immunity. They got to mount their own immune response. All of that takes a ton of energy. And if they're only being fed 4, or I would even argue 6 liters a day, they can't get it done. And then they become vulnerable. So it's this coming hand in hand. And there's lots of work out of Wisconsin. Sandra Godden's done a lot of work. Sheila McGurk's done this work showing simply increased planes of nutrition will decrease your risk for disease. I don't know, Betty Jo, if you've had any insights on that as well.
So yeah, I've been around, I guess, as a veterinarian long enough to kind of have seen the transition from, the limit feeding scenario to, to the increasing level of nutrition. And with the exception of some new diseases we've seen in Alberta, such as mycoplasma, that kind of messes up even the best management scenarios. Generally, I have seen a decrease in morbidity rates over time for sure. So agreed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There is another question here that popped up. So the question is, when you showed the picture of calves grouped, adding a single calf and a pair to an existing small group, it shows a milk feeder too. Was this done prior to weaning?
No, okay. No, everybody was weaned. They weren't getting milk. These were all weaned calves. But I mean, that's another question, is when do we regroup? We're actually doing a study right now. I'm doing this with Toma together. I meet with Toma every 2 weeks. We've got a master's student who we're actually looking at the effect of regrouping, taking these calves that have been individual and pair housed sort of for the first 4 weeks, and then regrouping them into a pen and seeing how they cope. The prediction is that any sort of regrouping, any sort of social contact is going to be beneficial in how to cope with new things. Cope in terms of competition, they're just more, I guess the word that I would like to use, I believe they're more resilient. because they've used to dealing with other calves. They're not freaked out. Like I have some videos that I've shown before, taking an individual calf and putting that into a group house pen. There's just all these yo-yos. I remember there was this person who was a big cow handling expert in the US. He was talking in front of me at one time, and he was talking about training, handling calves. And he actually had this picture of these newly weaned calves. And he actually said in front of the entire audience, well, any individual calves that have just put into a group, I ignore them for 10 days. You can't do anything with them because they're just so crazy. Which tells me that, I mean, that's, to me, is not the solution. It's just to ignore them, right? Whereas you take these pair house calves and they are calm. And I'll just tell one other anecdotal story. I was on a farm in Chilliwack, I think Chilliwack or Abbotsford. I was going there for a completely different reason. It was something to do with maternity pens. And I walk up and his calf hutches are all there. And he's got all these calf hutches he had these fences around them, so they were paired. And I went, oh, you take pair housing? And he looks at me and he goes, and then I said, oh, you got pair housing. I know. How are the intakes? How are you finding that? And he goes, yeah, I heard you give a talk a long time ago. Yeah, there may be increased intakes, but that's not why I did it. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, well, after I saw your talk, I did my own experiment. I took individual calves, kept them individual, and then I did a whole group where I pair housed them. I have an automatic milking system unit. And what sold me was training these cows to use the AMS unit. They were so calm. I wasn't fighting with them. They weren't freaked out. That's the reason I went to pair housing.
Okay, yeah. So we have a next question. I was also wondering if there has been comparisons trying to figure out the perfect time to introduce already social housed calves into larger groups, or when to combine them.
Okay, so I guess, well, let me just start with when are calves prepared when would I recommend any form of social housing, sort of pair housing or even larger groups? We consistently have done this as early as 3 to 5 days of age. I think there's some benefit to initially, just the first 24, 48 hours. I mean, you guys know this better than I do. Some calves are just a little bit sleepy. They just take a little bit to get going. Ideally, you want to see them being, when the milk comes, that they're excited to get their milk meal and those sort of things. So we've done that quite consistently for 3 to 5 days. And Toma's work would show that that's also when the calves, at least by 5 days, they want to be with other calves. I think the big issue is with group size is also considering what kind of milk feeding station you have and the age spread in that group. So if you have a milk bar with no way for the calf to enter and get access to the milk, and they're with 10 calves that are 5 weeks of age and they're 4 days old, I think you're going to have a problem. So, these are just sort of intuitive, practical things to consider.
I just have a random follow-up comment. I'm also a cow-calf producer. And what I notice with my baby calves is, they're born, they're vigorous on day 1, they suck colostrum, and then they sleep. They're very sleepy for 2 to 3 days.
Yeah.
And then after day 3, they come alive and they play with each other. And so I notice, just kind of observing my own cow-calf herd, and I don't think it would be any different for dairy calves, right? Is they really crave and want that social interaction quite early, like day 3 to 5, they really wake up. So just a kind of
and that's what we would see. I mean, we've never done the study where we group them on day 1, day 2, day 3, just looking at their behavior. Day 3 to 5, is, and then we also try to often get the dehorning done if we have to dehorn them in that period, so that you get that done and then they can regroup and they thrive.
Cool. We have another couple questions here. Ooh, quite a lot, sorry. Okay. Has there been any, oh, that was the first one, I'm sorry. How quickly do you recommend getting the calf up to 8 liters of milk on 2 feeds per day? I have found that the incidence of scouring is high if I push the amount of milk too quickly. I do bucket feed my calves.
Okay, I think the first thing is, I mean, yeah, I think for you, the first thing is to try to transition to a nipple feeding. We know that we see big fluctuations in intake in those first 3 or 4 days, you know, and one of the challenges I think is the fact that the cow is not there normally, and Jody will, I mean, I grew up in a beef cattle ranch too, so you know, when those calves are suckling off the cow has something to say about how long that milk meal is. And so one of the challenges that we have with these artificially reared calves is that there's no cow there that also walks away. What we do is we offer 8 liters, 4 liters in the morning, 4 liters in the afternoon, right from the get-go, but we don't force feed them. If they don't want it, we don't give it. Okay. We let them sort of self-regulate. The big thing with the scours is, and again, I'm not an expert physiologically, but we know that with bucket feeding, that calf its head is down, and whereas sorry that I'm doing this on Zoom, but when it's suckling, it's actually like this, and it's this position that actually closes what we call the esophageal groove, which bypasses the rumen, and so the milk goes straight into the stomach part, the abomasum. Mike Van Amber did work a number of years ago where he showed that there was increased what we call ruminal drinking, so spillage into the rumen, which could cause upsets as well. Whether or not that translates into scours is another story. But the other thing to remember is when calves are drinking lots of milk, their poop is going to be a lot runnier than if you've previously fed limited quantities of milk, their feces, it would have been much more firm. So loose feces doesn't necessarily mean it's not necessarily means digestive upsets and bad things. Of course, you got to work with your veterinarian to make sure that you don't have any bacterial challenges and all those sort of things in there. But I know Jeff Rush and Anne-Marie Depassier years ago, scientists were working on trying to come up and to really push a new diagnosis page for what does healthy feces look like on a calf-fed high plains of nutrition. I don't know, Jody, if you have any more comments, or Betty Jo, if you have any comments on that.
Get myself unmuted here. Yeah, so looser and also significantly more.
And way more, way more.
Yes, so, and that kind of goes back to, you know, making sure pens are clean, right? To kind of aid in disease prevention as well, like particularly in the larger groups, like 8 to 10 calves. If you feed them more, they're going to poop a lot more, so you need to clean a lot more. So just a side note on that.
Yeah, one thing that I would also, because I was in Idaho just before COVID on a farm, a calf ranch actually, I don't know, they had like 10,000 calves there. And this was a guy that was really trying to do the right thing and had I don't know, 10,000 calves. He had 500 of them that were his experimental calves that he would try things out on. Aside from the fact that he had California hutches, which if you've never seen a California hutch, it makes like a plastic hutch look like a palace. They're really, really tiny. Calves are often on slatted floors and they're wood and they can barely turn around. He had these California hutches and he had bought a bunch of hutches, the white standard hutch, and he was looking at pair housing. But he was having so he was increasing more milk. He was feeding with a nipple, but he had 2 calves in one hutch, and it was a disaster. And it was a disaster for exactly what the reasons that Betty Jo said, is that 2 calves, high volume of feces in a small space that was actually only ever designed for one. And they were standing in manure. So, you know, the one thing that if you're going to pair house, you need 2 hutches and twice the amount of space. What I can guarantee you is those calves will always be sleeping in 1 hutch together, but they can move back and forth.
As a producer myself too, I'm always worried that the rumen development is a bit underestimated if you feed so much milk or more milk than we do on our farm. How important is it that, like, if they also drink more milk, they eat less calf starter, is my opinion, and the rumen development should be very important as well. How do you see that?
So you and many other farmers have the same concerns. And I guess I want to rest assure you that if we can get this right for the rumen, but feeding high volumes of milk, absolutely, those calves, if you give them lots of milk, I'm not interested in starter. Like, forget this, you know. But think about from a natural perspective, these calves would not really be eating significant amount of grass or forage, even if they were out on pasture, significant amounts of volume or weight. What they do, and I'm sure Betty Jo have seen this, if you've got a bunch of beef cows and their calves, even at 2 weeks of age, are with them, and you fed the cows hay or silage, guarantee you those calves are standing beside their mom and they're starting to nibble. My feeling is that these calves, regardless of what we do, really want to become ruminants, and they need access to forage in order to get there. But we're already forcing them to do this at much younger ages than they would in nature. So what the feeding program that we've used and has been extremely successful, and it also translate into increased milk production down the road, is during the first 4 weeks of life, feed them as much as they want. You know, if you can, I mean, a minimum of 8 liters. And because what they are able to do is to take milk and convert it to lean tissue growth incredibly efficiently. They can't eat starter. They just simply cannot consume and digest a lot before 21, 23 days of age. They just, you have the starter there at 14 days. They may play with it. It may be spilled on the ground, but there's been tons and tons of studies. They just are not physically developed to eat it. So what we recommend is 8-10 liters till 4 weeks of age. And then over 4 or 5 days, bring that down to 10% of body weight. So that's going to probably be more like 6 liters a day. And what you're going to see is you're going to see starter intake go up. You feed them however long you want to feed them. They'll be eating starter. And then when you wean them, you again do it over 4 or 5 days, and you're going to see the starter go up even more. You're going to see those calves have probably 5, I think if I remember right, 5 to 7 kilo average in weight advantage. Transitioning off milk is way easier. But so you're feeding milk when the calf can only drink milk and only convert milk. And then at 4 weeks, you're bringing it down again.
Okay.
And that's been very successful.
Okay.
If you email me, Miranda, I can send you some graphs to show that.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll welcome that. Yeah.
There was only 20 minutes. I can only show so much.
Okay. We have another question, I think.
Jody has her hand up. I don't know.
Okay, Jody, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, no, there are just, Miranda, you're probably tackling it right now. There were some more questions in the chat and the Q&A, so I will let you field those.
Okay. The question I have here is, does the incidence of calf scours decrease if the calves are nipple fed?
Huh. I would say if they're nipple fed and fed high volumes. But again, it comes down to how you define scours. Because if they're fed high volumes of milk through a nipple, you're going to, they're just going to digest lots and lots of milk, and milk has a lot of water in it, and it has to go somewhere, right? So yeah, the other thing, and I would predict that I think nipple feeding helps the transition to becoming a ruminant in ways that, and this is my prediction, if you've ever watched a calf suck on a cow or suck on a nipple, especially if it's a small hole and they have to work really hard, what comes down? They slobber, right? That's a lot of bicarbonate. It's this chemical thing. And that's actually really good. So they will swallow a lot of that. And that actually helps keep the rumen pH higher. I mean, that's again, a positive for this nipple feeding. And you'll see them and they'll slobber like crazy. Calves have two things. They can become hungry, but they also have an innate motivation to suck. And so that's one of the challenges with bucket feeding, is that they have no place to actually suck something. And for those of you that have kids, there's reasons why parents use soothers because they're highly motivated to suck, right? And people don't want them sucking their kids sucking their thumb, because if the soother's not there, they go for something. Calves are no different. They're highly, highly motivated to suck. And that's why it's really important that they have access to the nipple. And ideally, for me, I think it's more naturalistic if they're actually consuming their milk through the nipple. And that's, again, I mentioned it, but just to reiterate that point, there was some work done on some farmers had decided, I guess it made logic sense. If, feeding calves takes time. I want to do everything I can to minimize that time. So, okay, I've gone to nipple feeding, so let's just make the hole bigger so the calves drink the milk faster. And they saw increased incidence of cross-sucking because the calves, there was no motivation. They weren't able to suck and work and do all those things while they were getting their milk. And so then they start sucking on other things.
Not to mention the risk of aspiration pneumonia and
Yes.
inner ear infections.
Okay, good. Good one.
Yeah. Okay, we'll go back over to the Q&A. Next question is, when grouping calves, do you have any comments on how big the groups should be?
Yeah, I mean, so this, I get really, really wiggly, at group sizes over 8 or 10. I mean, if you've never socially housed before, don't even do 8 calves. I would do the low cost transition is take your individual housing system, whatever that be, and try to figure out how to put 2 calves together. It's low cost. You've got, I don't know who, 10 to 1. This is also going to require changes in your calf feeding staff. So there's a bunch of things happening. So number one, if you're bucket feeding, don't go to group housing, figure out how to get the nipple feeding to work first. Get your staff on board, get them engaged in this, make sure that they want to make this work. Once they're nipple feeding and feeding at least 8 liters of milk, then do the pair housing. And for many farms, this will come down to farm size. Pair housing works really well. And they may never go more than that. I would then encourage you, if you do want to go more, is to go from pair and then go to 4. And then just see how it goes. And again, on some farms, the maximum may be 4. Those that want to do more can maybe go then from 4 to 8. But this is all, you've got to have your staff with you on this. And they've got to, they got to change the way they look at these calves. They've got to monitor them slightly differently. So going from on a farm where they're feeding calves individually to calves overnight to groups of 8 or 10, there's risk that will go wrong. And then you've got a disgruntled staff, you've got unhappy farmers. You don't feel great because you thought this was going to work and it didn't work.
Then I have another question here. I've heard of farms that are group fed on computer feeder, so higher levels of milk, and they are finding a large number of first lactation heifers coming in at 3/4 from milking from cross-sucking. This is very discouraging. How do you address this?
Yeah, I've heard of this before. What I don't know if there's been any science on this, and it's really hard to give a reason why without actually looking at the whole thing. One of the things where I have heard of it is where we have these larger groups and where calves have one milk feeder. So these automatic milk feeders. So let's say now you've got 20 calves, even though they're given higher volumes of milk on this one feeder. So depending on the programming and all that kind of stuff, when a calf is in there, let's say there's 20 calves in the group, there's one calf in the feeder. That means that 19 don't have access. And it could be a long time before the 19th calf actually gets access, which could, even though they're getting fed 8 liters a day, could increase the likelihood that they're going to cross suck. And then if they cross suck, the easiest place to cross suck is on that calf that's in the feeder. And where's the easiest place to cross suck if the calf is on the feeder is on, in between, because often there's a bar on top and the calf is in between the calf's legs. I have no science to say that that's what happens, but that's my prediction is, this could, because the other places where I've heard it's been where there's been these large groups and one feeder, and I don't know if there's any automatic calf feeder people on the call, but when these things are expensive, an automatic calf feeder, they're $20,000 a pop. They're often sold saying, look, you can feed 20 calves on that. And so, because you're trying to amortize that over per calf basis. So again, this is where I would get group feeding working really well in using a low cost input first, and then go to an automatic calf feeder, because to really manage those well on those really large groups is not easy.
So as a producer in our calf barn, we have individual hutches, but the calves can see each other and they can see the group and across from them. How social is that? Would that be social enough to get it satisfied? To have
So the answer to that is no. And that work's been done. So Margit Bak-Jensen in Denmark had a PhD student that did her entire PhD on that question alone. How much social contact is needed? And one of the studies that she did was she looked at this ability. So she had individual calves with they could only see the calves on the other side of the pen, across from them. She had individual where there was bars in between so they could sniff each other. And if I remember right, she had a pair housed was what I would say because it's called control, where they could have full contact. But then she had another one where she actually cut a hole between the calves so the calf could put its head into the other pen. And she looked at a bunch of different parameters and there was no difference. The calves that were pair housed, full social contact, were smarter, there was no difference between the other 3 groups. They just, they all acted like an individual housing.
Sorry, if I can just jump in here for a second. I know we have 8 minutes left and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but having said that, maybe Nina, because I did not see any more questions coming up, you could share your 4 or 5 slides on the cognitive effects of social housing.
Let me just see if I can quickly pick them up give me 1 sec. Hopefully.
Sorry, I really put you on the spot right now.
Oh, no, it's okay. It's just that I deleted them in the version that I showed. So I just had to not save the version and bring it up again.
Right. Yeah, but I think that would, because you talked about the cognitive development and everything, and I know you have some really nice slides. So if you could show those, then that would be great.
So we've done a lot of studies looking at social housing, and this was one, don't freak out at the cows and calves. This was the reason we did this study was there was old literature from the non-human primates, so people doing experiments on monkeys, where in the 1960s, they took individual monkey infants and removed them from their mom and housed them individually and gave them a puppet mum, like a teddy bear mum in replace of that. And they compared that to these primates that were born to their mother. There was a bunch of mothers together in a big enclosure. There was lots of things happening, but there was lots of mothers and lots of babies all together in this really complex social group. So we decided to do sort of replicate that. And what the non-human primate work showed is that those individual ones were more scared of food, very difficult to handle, high rates of what we call behavioral inflexibility. So they really struggled with learning and cognitive deficits. So we did a study where we had calves that were individually housed from day one up to 8 weeks of age. We weaned these calves at 8 weeks of age. Others that were individually housed for the first 6 weeks and then pair housed, versus pair housing from day 3 or 4. And then we had this complex cows and calves. And in this case, the cows also had bras on and calves would learn how to automatic feeder. But the take home message here is this is this complex environment. And then we trained calves to do a test. Actually, we did this twice, once with just pair housing versus individual, and then we did the big group. Here, so calves were taught to play a game, and I'll show you a video in a second, but they had to, and we clicker trained them like people train dogs, that they had to touch a start box with their nose, and then they had to go to the back of the screen, that look at the back of the pen. If half the calves, if the computer screen was red, they had to run there, touch it, and then they got a milk reward. If it was white, they weren't supposed to go. If they went, they got a timeout, basically had to wait for 2 minutes or something till the game started again. And this is just a video. So start box, this is calf is red. And then they drank, they got a little bit of milk, a couple hundred mils. So this is white. The calf knows that he's not supposed to go. So we taught these calves. And then what we did is we changed the rules. So once everybody learned how to do that, and let me tell you, just, it doesn't matter how you grew up, you can learn how to play that game. So whether or not you're individual, pair, whatever, you learn how to play the game. But then what we did is we changed the rules. If red was positive before, now you had to go to the white screen in order to get milk, and the same reverse for the red. And so this is the results of what we call the reversal. So just believe me, everybody learned how to play the game. But then when we looked at learning the new rules, doing the opposite, what you can see is that the individual calves really struggled. The group, which we predicted would be fantastic, was indeed over, they got almost 80% of every attempt they got right. The early pair was just as good. So these were the calves that were paired at 5 days of old age. But even pairing for the last 2 weeks, because they were weaned at 8 weeks, even pairing from 6 to 8 weeks showed some benefits. And so this is why I think, this is hugely, I think why, well, just let me tell another story. I had another farmer who listened to this talk, had a parallel parlor, and I had never thought about this before. And he goes, oh, that makes sense now. And I go, what do you mean? He says, well, I have all these cows that normally they enter the parallel parlor on the left-hand side. And so they go in and they learn how to make a turn to the left. I've had these odd cows that all of a sudden they end up on the other side of the barn for some reason. Now they got to do a right-hand turn, and it's a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. And I think this could explain why that happens. And we also know these pair house calves are more curious about new foods, will start eating new feed faster than the individual house calves.
Okay. Thank you, Nina, also for sharing those last few slides. I think that really complemented the whole talk. And I really wanted to thank you and Miranda and Betty Jo for joining, and you, Nina, for presenting this, and Miranda and Betty Jo for facilitating this talk. And I think it's very nice to hear the farmers' perspectives through Miranda, and then also complemented that with Betty Jo's vet perspective. So yeah, I think it was another successful coffee talk. And thank you also to all the attendees for all of your questions and for attending. And I just wanted to mention that we will send all of today's attendees a link to the recording of this coffee talk, as well as to any relevant research papers related to today's topic of the calf housing. And you will also get the attendees get an link to a survey. If you could please fill that out, because that will help us improve these coffee talks as well as the DRACA activities or events. So your feedback would definitely be used. Next week's coffee talks will be about dairy cattle health and management. So we hope that we will see many of you again next week.
And I just wanted to say, I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. If you have any other questions, just email me.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and we will also include your contact in our follow-up email. So yeah, with that, I would like to wrap it up for today, and hopefully see many of you next week.